Tonight we look at the value of virtue, and this will be followed in March with Father Raymond's final lecture on the value of charity. Father Raymond is very uniquely positioned to talk about all of these issues. He is, in addition to being a senior fellow in the Work in Economics program here at Cardus, he also has academic training in this field with a Master's of Arts in Economics from Cambridge. He is also a professor of economics at Queen's University, and you can read him also in the National Post on Saturdays as a columnist. And in addition to all of this, he gains tremendous insight in virtue as parish priest at Holy Cross Parish in Kemptville as well. So without further ado, I'll invite Father Raymond to take the stage and ask you to welcome him.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Renze. And good evening to you all. Some of you have been here for this is your third time. And so I appreciate that you've come back after the first two. It might be more attractive to you that you get to eat and drink while I lecture, a privilege that my students in economics don't get, and certainly my parishioners are not allowed to have a glass of wine while they listen to me preach. So, but it's good to have you back. So this is our third session. If you come to all four, and we keep track of who's here, Cardus will give you each $1,000 if you come to all four lectures. We didn't announce that at the beginning because that would undermine the virtue of attending, right? So you see the relationship. And those of you who are here for the first time probably feel like, I wish I'd come to the early ones, right? But there's a few who are here, so Renzi will handle the logistics of the payments. It's a bit like winning the lottery. You actually get $10 for the next 100 years, I believe, is how we pay it out. So the approach we've been taking in these lectures is how the Christian faith might think about economics, or if you want to put it slightly differently, how someone informed by Christian faith might look at economic questions. And the first one was about the question of work, labor, employment. Second one was about the question of freedom, liberty. And today we're going to look at virtue. And then the fourth one is on charity. So we're going to start actually with a video clip. So for those of you who are teenagers in the 1980s, as I was, there was a very famous film. It's actually become one of the few films from that time where certain scenes are remembered. It was called Wall Street. Starred Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen. And it was about oh, here it is. It's already up there. And so Michael Douglas, who's here, is playing the character. He's a corporate raider. At that time in the 1980s, this was a kind of big phenomenon that a investment firm or so would take over and buy a company, not really with the idea of letting the company sort of thrive, but sell off its parts. And, and the drama of the film is that there's a young man who works at the company, rather a young man who works for Gordon Gekko, who's played by Michael Douglas, and his father works for the company that's going to be broken up. So that's the drama. But at this big shareholder meeting, Michael Douglas gives the famous "Greed is Good" speech, which if maybe you haven't even seen the film, but you've heard of the speech. So we'll start with that, and then we'll continue. So I'll get out of the way here.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
So The objection is made that Michael Douglas's character is motivated just by greed and not concern for the good of the company or the customers or the workers or anything else. And so he defends it. He said, well, greed is good. Greed cuts through, it clarifies, it focuses you. And greed for money, love, power has marked the upward development of human beings throughout history. So he's making quite a claim. Why I start with that is because, first of all, many people actually think that about economics, is that the world of economics, this is the world of finance, but the world of economics more broadly is a world in which greed is good, and that greed is encouraged, that greed is rewarded, and therefore they have a suspicion or even an aversion to the world of economics, world of business, because they say this is a morally corrupting enterprise. It's a place where, that is akin, that it rewards bad behavior, ignoble behavior. Right? And a lot of Christians actually would agree with Gordon Gekko, not on his conclusion that greed is good, but that greed is rewarded or greed is powerful. And so he's praising it. Other people say, well, he's right about what's actually going on there, but we're against it. Right? So it's actually not an unusual point of view. And if you look at literature, certainly in movies and television dramas and so forth, the businessman, the wealthy person even, generally is not portrayed as a virtuous person. Obviously it's not always that way, but that's often the view, is that wealth corrupts, and even the process of gaining wealth corrupts. So that's a very common point of view. And therefore, there's a suspicion of that world because it undermines virtue, or it rewards unvirtuous or vicious, vice-promoting behavior. And this view is not far from being a strange Christian view. It actually has pretty good roots in our scriptures, right? So St. Paul tells us in 1 Timothy that the love of money is the root of all evil. Very strong statement. Right? The root of all evil is the love of money. And so if you say, well, economic activity is aimed at making money, then the goal of making money is pretty close to loving it. You can make money without loving money, but it's not a big gap between making money and loving money. And if that's the root of all evil, then maybe I should just keep my distance from making money, because it would be easy if I devote a lot of time to it to love money. That's the root of all evil. We have that exchange, very powerful exchange between Jesus and the rich young man, Matthew 19. And the man is described as being a rich young man, and he's described as being a virtuous young man. And when he speaks about himself, when we presume honestly, he says he's kept all the law. He's a virtuous man. And yet, when he's invited to detach himself from his goods and to come and follow Jesus, he goes away sad. And we're told he goes away sad because he had great possessions. So we say, okay, this is an admirable young man. He's lived the law. He's looking for something good. He approaches Jesus. He wants eternal life, and he's undermined by his great possessions, and he goes away sad. And Jesus, observing this, then says to his disciples, I tell you, it is harder for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than to pass through the eye of the needle. Right? It's not talking about a sewing needle, but it doesn't matter. It's very difficult, right? And again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. When his disciples heard it, they were amazed, exceedingly amazed, and they said, who then can be saved? But Jesus said to them, with men it is impossible, with God all things are possible. So, which is, by the way, what the Archangel Gabriel says to Mary at the Annunciation. So, are we saying that a virginal conception is on the same level as a rich man getting into heaven, right? Or it seems on the face of it that only a special act of divine providence or intervention could offer salvation to the rich. So the scriptures, the gospels in particular, are very, they warn very strongly about the danger of riches. Sermon on the Mount, we know very famously, blessed are the poor in spirit, Beatitudes. In St. Luke chapter 6, it's even stronger. Right? Matthew says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall be in the kingdom of God. In Luke chapter 6, 6:20, it's blessed are the poor, period. Right? So Matthew could say, well, you could be a rich person and be poor in spirit, but Luke doesn't even say poor in spirit. He says, blessed are the poor. So that kind of suspicion of economic activity, of business success, of acquisition of money is very, you can't, it's clear in the New Testament, both in the letters and in the Gospels themselves. There are other things that should be noted there from a biblical point of view, that Jesus' parables, they're drawn from everyday life, and everyday life is economic life, right? That's what we do most of the time. Economic life is not, as I said this in the second lecture, economic life is not the most important thing that we do, but it's what we do most of the time. So that's why it's so important, right? We spend most of our time, if you live in a house, you're paying for that house all the time, right? If you eat, most people do, that's an economic activity. So Jesus draws his parables from everyday life, so many of them have an economic flavor, about investment, about purchasing, about the harvest, agricultural images, and so forth. And there's some lessons there. They're not principally about economics. Jesus mostly starts his parables by saying, the kingdom of heaven is like, right? He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is a vineyard. He's not giving advice on how to operate payroll for a vineyard. He says the kingdom of heaven is like that. But he uses those images. And there are some lessons to be learned there about investment, about hard work, about the capacity to see value where others don't see value, to see the pearl in the field, the pearl of great price, or the treasure in the field, to understand, there's something valuable there that others don't see. That's an economic activity. We see him praising generosity with goods, right? So we have in the encounter of the widow's mite, a very poor woman who's very generous with what little she has, and Jesus praises the spirit of generosity, going so far as to say that she's given more than all the others because she gave out of her need as opposed to out of her abundance. So the spirit of generosity is praised. We have the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. So the Good Samaritan may not have been a wealthy man, but he was a trader, he was a businessman, it appeared. He was going about his work, and he had enough money to actually care for the man in the parable who had been brutalized, to treat his wounds, to pay for the innkeeper, to care for him, and something. Margaret Thatcher, she had her own kind of idiosyncratic commentary, biblical commentary she would offer. She took her Christian faith quite seriously, and so she was always eager, against largely Christian critics, to defend her positions with biblical references. And she was very fond of saying that the Good Samaritan would have been of no use to anyone if he was poor, right? Which is not really the point of the parable, but she used to say that. But there's a point to that, right? That he had to have some resources to be generous with the man who was brutalized in the parable. And then you also have very clear examples given to us of how riches, material riches, can make one spiritually blind or foolish. So, for example, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. Right? Lazarus was a poor beggar at the gate, and the rich man was feasting and had a very, grand lifestyle, and he literally didn't even notice. Right? He was unable to see. And we're only, the parables that we're told about the characters in the parables, what we need to know about them. And he's the rich man. That's his problem. Right? We don't know anything else about him. But his riches have caused him to be even literally doesn't even notice the poor man at the gate. Or another parable where you have foolishness, the riches of the man who has had a great harvest, and he says, I'll build bigger barns, I'll tear down my barns, build bigger barns, and everything is set, right? I'm totally self-sufficient, don't have to worry about today, tomorrow, eternity. I'm, eat, drink, and be merry. And of course, that very night he dies in that parable. So we see that. So we have a picture that warns very clearly about the dangers of wealth, the spiritual dangers that it can lead, or the love of wealth can lead actually to all kinds of evil, how it can frustrate us from accepting our vocation to discipleship in the case of the rich young man. It's not possible to read the Gospels and the New Testament letters and not be nervous about prosperity. If you can read the New Testament and not be nervous about prosperity, then chances are you're not nervous about anything spiritually, right? Because it's a very common theme. So we have to take that into account, and it's true that riches in themselves are not condemned, but relevant to our topic this evening, it seems that the life of virtue and the world of business and the reality of prosperity, that there's a threat there, that it could undermine our virtue, and perhaps even the acquisition of wealth or the simple work of business can be undermining of virtue. So that's our background and our topic this evening. So I want to address that in three parts tonight. The first part is a little bit about the history of our discipline of economics and about the most famous figure associated with the beginning of the discipline, Adam Smith, and a little bit about how he thought about these questions, because Adam Smith is often used today as to say that his view is that self-interest should be encouraged in a way that a Christian would not think about self-interest, because that's what is good for economic life. That's often what's said about him. I don't think that's correct to say that, but examine that. So that's the first part. The second part is a little bit about virtues and character and what economic life, and especially market economics, what it encourages and what it maybe discourages. And the third part is a little broader, look at why it is that we might think, or rather put it this way, how we think about the nature of economic activity conditions whether we think it's virtue enhancing or virtue undermining. That's our agenda for the evening. So the discipline of economics, if we'd been around in the year 1700 or 1724, and you were looking for a professor of economics or a department of economics, you wouldn't have found one. There was no such discipline. Economic questions, even in the ancient Greek philosophers, most of the Greek philosophers did not address economic questions. Aristotle did, and he was a bit of an exception, because he paid attention to sort of how do you manage a household. And if you think about what a household is, shelter, food, clothing, those kinds of things, those are economic questions. Were then, when he was around in the 4th century BC, and they're economic questions today. People, when they're anxious, what they're anxious about, housing costs and rent and food prices and so forth. No one's really ever anxious about clothing, I notice. It doesn't seem to be a thing that bothers people very much. But those basic household things. So Aristotle did give attention to the management of the household. It's actually where the word economics has its roots. But it wasn't a principal concern. And then, throughout the whole Christian period, at certain points, Aristotle was better known and sometimes less well known. But to the extent that people looked at economic questions, it was as philosophers did, like Aristotle, or perhaps as moral philosophers did, like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. And that was where economic questions were dealt with, basically under philosophy, under ethics, justice, those kinds of things. That's where people looked at economics. What changed was, say, around the year 1500 or 1600, something new took place in the world, or specifically in Northwestern Europe, which is that you have year on year, decade on decade, economic growth, right? For most of human history, most populations in most parts of the world have lived on roughly $3 a day, contemporary measures, right? So if you were in, I don't know, if you were in Greece and with walking around with Aristotle, that would be the kind of the thing. If you were at the Pharaoh, 700 years before, with Moses, and 800 years before. And then something changed, is that you have sustained economic growth in basically Northwestern Europe and Netherlands and England, Scotland. And so people began to say, what is happening? Why is there more and more year on year? What's happening? And so you have this great question, which is the title of Adam Smith's book in 1776, An Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. What's happening? Where is this wealth coming from? That was the question. And there are competing answers to that question, right? And he had quite an innovative answer. And I'm going to start with that because it's actually less interesting to us than the other part I want to talk about. But his answer is that new ways of doing things are creating wealth. The older view was that wealth came because you had your stuff and they had their stuff, and somehow you got their stuff over to your place. One way was by invading them and taking it, right? Another way would be to tax trade back and forth, right? So there's trade going back and forth, and whoever the sovereign authority is puts a tariff. This was before income taxes and consumption taxes, but you have a tariff, and then that goes to the treasury, and so your country gets more stuff, right? And the merchant class, which did all this, were the agents of the accumulation, right? So that view, very, very simple summary of it, was called mercantilism because associated with merchants. And Adam Smith said, no, I don't think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is that people, ordinary folks, are organizing themselves to provide better means to cooperate in production of things, right? And what we call the division of labor, to simplify things. So they figure out, I can make, famous example of the pins, you can make pins in a factory more efficiently than if you're at home making individual pins, right? So it takes a long time to make an individual pin. If you get 30 people working together doing each little part of the pin making process, you end up making 1,000 pins in a day, right? And so they're much cheaper. So that was one insight. The other insight, which is more important, is that he said that people are able now, and he observes this, he says, they look at what needs might exist, and with their own ingenuity and resources and with collaborating with others, they try and meet that need. Right? So he's focusing on production and exchanging. And he said, so if you have these free exchanges going on, all of a sudden, the baker, his famous example of the baker, figures out, okay, if I make, croissants in this fashion for this price, people will want them and they will come and buy my croissants, and I'll be able to hire people, and wealth is created, right? So to us, that seems very, because his view prevailed, and he's already, 250 years ago, it doesn't strike us as very remarkable to observe that, but it was new then. But what's relevant to this discussion, so that's basically, 2-minute summary of the wealth of nations. But what's more interesting is how Adam Smith looked at the sort of the interior, if you want to say, the mental act of what's going on. And before that, remember, he's a moral philosopher, right? Only after him, and in the subsequent, say, century and a half, did you get political economy emerging from moral philosophy, and then eventually economics and politics emerging from political economy, right? Which is really a, say, early 20th century phenomenon. So Smith is trying to figure out how is it that people act, or how should they act. He's a moral philosopher. And what's interesting for our purposes is how similar he sees the moral act and the economic act. So I will try to simplify it as much as I can. So the moral act, what Smith said, what goes on when I'm deciding how should I treat this person in front of me? How should I act morally? He says the first stage of that is an act of recognition. That's my term, not his term. So, that I recognize that this person is like me. We would use the term human nature really for that, but he don't think he used that term that much. But that I recognize this one is like me. So unlike a tree or the land or the river or a cow or something else, this one is like me. So we share something in common, right? Probably today we would use words like common nature, human nature, or equality. Those weren't the terms that he would have used so much in 1770s, but there's something in common. So that's the first. I recognize that this one is like me. So when I'm deciding how I should treat this one, I have to take into account that he's like I am. Then the second stage is imagination, which is a term he does use. So because this one is like me, I can imagine how he would like to be treated. I don't know him, especially if he's a stranger, right? So if he's a stranger, it's an interesting question, right? If you say, why should I treat a stranger in this fashion or that fashion? I have no idea. He's a stranger. How do I know how he would like to be treated? Right? Maybe he likes to be treated rudely. Maybe he likes to be cheated. Maybe he likes to be assaulted. I've never met him. On what basis do I have to think, oh, he would prefer not to be assaulted? How do I know that, right? What basis do I have? You know, I meet a stranger, I offer to shake his hand. I say, nice to meet you. Maybe he finds that offensive. You have no basis for that, right? There's no basis to know that. But Smith said, well, I can recognize he's someone like me, and I have this imaginative capacity to say, well, if that's how I would like to be treated, that's how he would like to be treated. It doesn't sound that astonishing, but it actually is. It's a huge advance in human wisdom, which is why you find it often characterized as the golden rule in most religious traditions. If you prefer philosophical condition, Immanuel Kant, it's a very difficult way he gets there, but he eventually gets to the idea that if we're the same thing, I should treat you in the same way that everybody else could treat everybody else that way, and it would be okay. Right? That's not a very elegant summary of his philosophy, but it's the main point. Not the main, it's the main gist of it, right? So Smith develops this and says, okay, so because I can recognize and imagine how you would like to be treated, then the third stage is how will I actually treat you? And if I have benevolence, right, which is literally Latin for goodwill, if I have benevolence, then I'll treat you as I think or I can imagine you would like to be treated because that's how I would like to be treated, and we're the same thing. Right? So that's the three-stage process, right? And it's a pretty powerful analysis, right? To recognize, to imagine, and then once I can imagine how you would like to be treated, then my goodwill towards you says I should treat you that way. So that's pretty straightforward, but obviously the critical question then comes, is there goodwill or not? Where does the goodwill come from? And then you have to find some other source of that. It could be an ethical theory, it could be biblical revelation, it could be family custom or whatever. But if there's benevolence, then I can act well towards you because I know how to act well towards you. So that's his moral act. I think that's pretty clear. Where the benevolence comes from is the issue. If you lack benevolence, the first two can get you to what you should do, but you may not do it. Right? When Adam Smith looks at the economic act, he said, what's going on in the economic act? He said, well, it's the same thing. First of all, I have to recognize that these other people who are in my ambiance are like me. So I get hungry, they get hungry, right? And I can imagine that they might enjoy a croissant or a meat pie or whatever I can make. I can imagine that. I also can use my imagination for how I might meet that need with other people that I know, with my resources, whatever, right? So those two faculties are the same, or those two, I don't know, faculties you want to call them, but anyway, recognition, imagination. But here's where it's different. He says, because in economic life, I don't need benevolence, right? In moral life, I need benevolence. Otherwise, will I follow through in what I know I should do? But he said in economic life, he said, it's self-interest. I provide the meat pie because it's in my interest to have a good meat pie, to run my bakery, to earn a living, etc. Right? So you have two different acts. So if you want to say the philanthropist says, well, this person I can imagine would like a meat pie, and I'll just give him one because I have goodwill towards him. Right? But what if I don't have goodwill towards him? Then I won't. Maybe I'll steal his meat pie because I know that he likes it and he might be inclined to eat his before I get a chance to eat it myself, whatever, right? But self-interest is different. And that's why Smith says that self-interest, the baker produces good goods, or the quality goods, better to say that, quality goods at a reasonable price for his customers, not because he's interested in their well-being, but he's interested in his own. But the fact is, he actually does serve the well-being, right? So that's what he means by self-interest. He's not saying that you should be selfish or self-absorbed. His praise of self-interest is that, in a certain sense, you getting your meat pie in the moral category depends on the goodwill of another. And he says, but in the economic sense, it depends on the self-interest of the other, right? Which situation would you want to be in, right? Now, maybe if you're someone with no resources whatsoever, you'd prefer, okay, I need to depend on someone giving me this gift. Fine. We talked about gifts did we talk about gifts last time? I think we did, didn't we? Or maybe the first time. But you know, if you have resources, you might prefer that there would be someone who would sell you a meat pie because you could be more sure of that. In fact, we have a whole industry that provides, agricultural products and food for people. And that's how most people have their needs met. So the point at the very beginning of our discipline is that Smith is not arguing for selfishness, which many people say self-interest today, they mean selfishness. The two things are quite different. He's not arguing for selfishness. In fact, he would say economically, if you're really selfish, that is, I'm not concerned about what my customers want, or I'm too self-absorbed to notice, you're not going to be successful in business. Right? In order to have a successful business that endures, you have to regularly meet your customers' needs. Right? And in fact, successful entrepreneurs spend a lot of time thinking about, what their customer needs, right? So, for example, we're in Ottawa here, so easy to think of public sector examples. So I was recently had to call, there's a flight mix-up. And I called the number to rebook, and as soon as they answered, they said, it was an automated voice, and said, Raymond D'Souza, sorry that your flight has been, you missed your connection. Here's what's rebooked. And then they sent a text with the hotel everything. Very impressive. It was an American airline. And I thought, that's pretty impressive. I was actually a bit spooked first because I thought, how do they, like, they obviously have my phone number, but they seem to know a lot about me, but hey, that's the world we live in today. So, that's a very high level of service that somebody put a lot of time and effort into doing that. And given that they're a total stranger to me, it wasn't because they were, motivated by goodwill. They thought, well, if we offer this, this will be good for our business. It's quite a remarkable level of service, right? We just had in the news last week or 2 weeks ago, the ArriveCan. They talked about the controversy over the government that developed the ArriveCan app for crossing the border during the pandemic, and the cost was very high and so forth. I don't know how much this airline spent on their app. I doubt it was $55 million. I doubt. It could be. I don't know. I don't do those things. But what's the difference between those two things, right? Is that in one environment, you have to make it easy, right? And they made it so easy. All I had to do was dial the number, and it was done, right? As soon as they, if that's not your interest, right? And I'm not picking on government here necessarily, because there's a reason why the government couldn't do that. For example, if you called a government number and they said, Raymond D'Souza, I understand that you want to travel to the United States, you'd say, well, hold on a second, privacy and all the rest of it. But a company doesn't have to worry about that, because when you check in there and you check that little box that has 7,000 words of terms and conditions behind it that no one reads, it says right there, you give us a right to ransack all of your electronic information in order to make your flight connections better, right? So there's a difference. So it's not a criticism of public sector, but it shows how that service of the needs of others is at the heart of at least how Smith thought about entrepreneurial activity. So I'll stop with that example and that clarification, because Smith's economic or analysis of economic activity comes out of his analysis of moral activity, and they're very similar in that they're other directed. You have to think about others, right? And he actually thought it was quite marvelous that in the moral sphere, benevolence was required, and you had to acquire that virtue elsewhere, whereas in the economic sphere, it didn't require the virtue of benevolence. Self-interest was enough. And given how important economic life is, he thought that was actually a benefit. Okay, that's part one. So part two, which is going to be briefer, virtues that are encouraged in the market, or character that's encouraged in the market. So a very common thing you might hear parents say about, say, a teenage child is, I'm eager for him to get a job, right? I think it'd be good for him, summer job or part-time job, very common thing you hear. And it's usually not because of the money, although it might, you could imagine it helps a little bit, or maybe they think it'd be good for the son or daughter to learn how to manage money. But usually what they have in mind is that there's some good character building traits or virtues that are going to come out of that, right? You can think of very good pious Christian parents, right? Saying, oh, it'd be great for Daniel, I'll use Daniel because that's your name. Daniel, it'd be great for Daniel to get a job because, boy, he's 16 and he's quite, he's such a good kid, and it would be really good for him to learn how to love money so that he could get an early start on the roots of all evil, right? But, that's actually a more biblical approach than saying it'd be great for him to get a job and learn virtues. But you don't find that. You can find it, you have to look harder to find it, right? It would be, no one ever says, at graduation, we're so proud of Daniel, he's graduated from, what did you graduate from? No, discipline field. Political science. Say, great, he's got a degree in political science, he can, become an analyst, communications professional, and he's going to make a good living, and he's going to have lots of possessions, and so when he meets the Lord Jesus, he will go away sad. Right? So, but that would be a Christian should think that way, right? That would be a biblical way to think, right? We should protect our children from that. We shouldn't send them out into the workforce where all of these virtues can be undermined. But of course, we observe the opposite. And in fact, people are often eager for their children to have experience of work or even running their own business. Like you could imagine, encourage a teenager to do a snow shoveling in the neighborhood, and or lawn mowing or something like that, to learn a little bit about business, because we see that there are virtues there. So it's actually quite common that, despite the very clear warnings in the scriptures, it's very, one might say, even universally acknowledged that there are good habits, virtues, character building that take place in the world of work that somehow or the other are not as easily acquired elsewhere, right? So, parents might say to their adolescent children, I've tried to teach you this and haven't been successful, but when you have to, you're always late for everything in the house, but when you get a job, I want you'll learn you have to be on time. So there's even a view that something better, some better kind of training in virtue, in some respects, is available in the world of work, right? That fine, you say you should clean your room, you don't clean your room, it's been 6 months, but when you're at work, you have to get whatever task you've promised, you have to get done, otherwise you'll lose your job. So it's a very common experience that we look to the world of work, right, for some training in virtue and building of good character. So we can consider the second part of the talk, that are there virtues that are encouraged by the market, or are there vices? What do we find there, right? And so we find certainly there are certain virtues. So for example, if you're running your own business, you have to be honest, right? If you're a contractor and you defraud either your suppliers or your customer, at a certain point, your business is going to lack either suppliers or customers, right? If you don't pay your bills, your suppliers aren't going to continue to supply you, right? If you take advantage of your customers, maybe the first time you can, maybe even the second time, but eventually you'll run out of customers, right? If you create a very unpleasant environment for your employees, if you berate them, if you're very sullen around them, if it's a miserable place to work, you'll have trouble getting employees. So even a very nasty person might try and create a cheerful environment at work, just so that the employees rather work well. In the 1980s, there was kind of a fascination at the rise of Japan for these enormously successful Japanese companies, especially automobile companies. And people were fascinated because, at the Toyota factory, especially when they started building plants in the United States and Canada, well, I think the United States first. Anyway, the Toyota managers would come over, and all the employees in their matching outfits would start the day, and they'd be in a big hall, and the manager would give a pep talk, and they'd do some sort of they'd sing songs, and they'd chant and do calisthenics, and everybody thought, this is very weird, behavior. But it was because their view was, we want a pleasant working environment, and we want people to like working here because they'll be better workers. So they thought it was in their business interest to create a environment that didn't treat workers simply as cogs in a machine. And now that way of thinking, Walmart does it, right? They all get there in the morning and they sing songs and whatever. So it's not but at that time it was considered an unusual approach. So there are lots of virtues. We might call them kind of the virtues of commercial virtues. So industriousness, honesty, punctuality, right? That's one thing. When you get a job, you learn how to be on time, right? Cleanliness, right? So take our typical adolescent who leaves his room in a terrible state, but then he goes to a restaurant and he learns how to clean a table so it's spotless, right? Because the customer comes in and the table is filthy, they don't want to sit there, right? So apparently he can't learn how to be clean at home, right? But he learns it outside, right? And there's many things like that. So I think we can say that while there is the opportunity for exploitation, there's always the opportunity for exploitation, for dishonesty. All vices are always possible. The more freedom there is in the market relations, the more that's punished, right? If you're a dishonest mechanic and there are 10 other mechanics in your town, you're not going to be a successful mechanic for a while. If you're a dishonest mechanic and there's only one other mechanic in town, or you're the only mechanic in town, right? Or if there's 10 mechanics and they're organized by a criminal underboss, right? Just, you're laughing, but it's not a rare phenomenon, right? Then there's actually, that's what we call, it's not legal, but it's a cartel, right? So a lot of the freedom in the economy allows room for virtue to grow. When it's restricted, right, then some of that opportunity for virtue. So there's lots of virtues that we learn, and it's a very common. It's not a Christian thing. I'd say it's a universal thing. People look to economic life as a school of virtue and a reward for virtue, right? A reward for virtue. If you ever listen to the great, investment guru Warren Buffett, he sounds sometimes like a preacher when people ask him about his investment philosophy. He says, we don't invest in things. He distinguishes investment from speculation. He says, we don't invest in things that we just think someone will pay us more for later. He calls that speculation. So you buy a company, nothing changes about the company, but for whatever reason, 6 months later, people pay more for it. And I mean, there's something wrong with that from an ethical point of view, but he said, that's not what we do. He said, we invest in companies where we think there's something good is happening in the company, and because it's doing something good, its value will increase over time, right? I mean, he's talking about investment advice, but with changing only very few words, you could imagine a father talking to a son and saying, devote your energy to doing something good and a value, not just something that other people will think is exciting later on. Right? He sounds a lot like the kind of moralist in his investment philosophy. Now, at the same time, we would say that, are there things in the market that might discourage virtue or even encourage vice? And I think that probably those are more on the consumption side than on the production side. So a lot of people are trying to persuade us to buy things, right? And if they're good at it, they're persuading us to buy something because it'll make our life easier or better somehow, right? No one ever offers to sell you something, that use this detergent, it'll take longer to clean your clothes and they'll leave them dirtier, right? So this is better. This washing machine is better. This car is better. This food is better. And so if it is better, you'd be attracted to it. But we know that acquisitiveness, attachment to goods, what we would probably broadly call consumerism or consumer mentality, can be a spiritual danger, right? It's called materialism. It's very common. Big struggle in a prosperous country like ours to keep our detachment from goods, right? We have so many goods that we now have, big storage industry, right, to store our excess goods. Right? A lot unlike the man in the barn, right, building his barns. If you go down the Queensway, if you go out, going west towards the 416, there's like a 6-story building, which is just storage. You might, if you're not, they had Ukrainian flags in it at one point. What I'm talking about there on going east. So, but aside from their position on the invasion of Ukraine, I'm not sure what else goes on there. But the entire building is just to store goods in, right? And so, so you have to be careful about that. And also, in our common experience, we have that, don't we? Where we caution people, right? Try to caution ourselves as well, is that maybe to limit our exposure to advertising, or we try to be careful about, do I really need something, not to make all my wants into needs. We try and educate people in that. One of the problems, for example, in Canada, one of our economic worries, I'm not sure if it's a problem yet, but certainly a worry, is that we have very, very high levels of household indebtedness. I mean, they're very, very high, higher than even the United States was just before the financial crisis. And everybody said, looking back on the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, they said, that was one thing that made it very precarious, is because levels of household debt were very high. And so when things went sideways, it was very devastating. Well, in Canada, we're much higher than that. So why has that happened, right? Well, it's happened 15 years of low interest rates, right? if you have low inflation and low interest rates, which are good in some ways, they also encourage you to take on debt because it's very cheap. And then we also have, so that's, say, on the monetary policy side. We also have a big financial industry that if their returns are very low, because interest rates are very low, the way that they can expand their business is by more loans, right? So, you know, if you ever had the experience of, unbeknownst to you, being offered a credit card, you know, saying, you know, you qualified for a credit card or whatever, you know, I think I have credit cards that I pay my debts on time that have credit limits that are probably 10 times more than I've ever spent. Right? Every once in a while they send you a note, you've got an increased limit, you can have a line of credit, whatever. So we have a culture, financial culture, a monetary policy for many years that encourages indebtedness, right? The Bible is very clear on the dangers of debt. Right? Now, they had a different financial system there, and so not all of the provisions apply in the same way today, but that was a reality, right? So you can observe that on the consumer side, spending, acquisition, debt, these are things that biblical approach warns us against. But you'd have to say our common experience in the market pushes us in the opposite direction, right? So that would be an example of where our economic life is undermining that particular set of virtues. So it's not only one thing or the other thing, it's both. Okay, should probably finish up here. I want to talk about the third part, which is a little bit more conceptual, and that is about how we conceive of economic life in general, because why we might have the view that we started off with, that economic life is prone to ignoble behavior or rewards vicious behavior, partly comes from the way we think about economic life. So when we think about economic life, do we think of it primarily as a competitive reality or a cooperative reality? So it's both, but what do we really think it is? So if we think it's competitive, so when we're in a competition, I'm not saying a bad competition, even sports competition, right? Or it could be a spelling bee or something like that, or music recital. The other person involved is a rival, right? So I have to, in some way, defeat the other. It's a competition. So either, either she wins or I win, right? So it's a rivalry, and I have some interest in defeating her, which would mean, anyway, in some way, my interest is to diminish, right? So if we're playing the championship game, either I win or he wins. So my goal is to win, but the goal includes this other person losing, right? You can't have both outcomes. So there's a rivalry there, and a rivalry at least looks at the other as well as a rival, but maybe even as a threat, maybe as an enemy, right? The competitive environment already puts my interest against the other interest. That's why it's a competition, right? I'm applying for a scholarship, right? There's only one scholarship. I want to apply for it. My best friend has also applied for it. I love my best friend, but I want him not to get the scholarship, right? So competition means that, surprising maybe to me, I'm actually desiring a bad outcome for my good friend, because if it's a competition, right? We both can't get the scholarship. So competition by its very nature puts interests, opposes interests, and can lead you to desire, even indirectly, but really a negative outcome for the other person, right? In an extreme case, ethically, rivalry can even lead to actively damaging the other. So for example, if the rival is a threat to your health or well-being, you can disarm him, or, in an extreme case, you can even in self-defense inflict harm on him. That's a different kind of rivalry, but that's the world of rivalry and competition. You see a rival, our interests are opposed. For my interests to advance, his interests have to diminish, right? That's so. Do we think of economic life like that? If we do, then we can see where the ground is prepared favorably for behavior that is not aimed at the good of the other, and therefore could actually be immoral behavior, or if not immoral, at least not generous towards the other. Right? You can see that. So, for example, I know you're on the street here. There are 4 different food trucks, and you're walking towards the food truck, and each of the food truck operators is hoping that you don't go to the other one. Right? He's hoping that you come to him, but you're only going to have, well, I suppose you could go to all 4, but he wants you to not choose the others. Right? That's rivalry. And he may be tempted, you could see, Maybe he spreads a rumor, the neighboring truck everybody ate there yesterday got sick. Right? Or post a photograph of some, very unpleasant conditions in their kitchen or whatever, right? You could imagine that there's an incentive for me to engage in not just good behavior to prevail, but even bad behavior. And if we think of the world of economics as principally competitive, we can say, look, that's why you've got to be careful. You're always going to be tempted to do something underhanded to undermine your rivals. Right? Because if you have rivals, just like in sports, right? If you're going for the gold medal in figure skating, maybe you think it's a good idea to take a crowbar and smash the ankle of your competitor. Only people of a certain age laugh at that because it actually happened. Right? Right. Or you might be more contemporary. You might be tempted to break the rules, right? If you're not allowed to steal the signs of your opponent, you find a way to do it or whatever, right? And football and so forth. We see that, and so we say that's what economic life is like. It's competitive, and there's rivalry, and interests are opposed, and therefore you're on the verge always of being dragged towards doing something bad towards your rival. And that's logically holds together, and that's probably why the scriptures are so, almost severe on some of these points. But you can also think of economic life as cooperative, right? So you can think of cooperative economic life. So you think of, we're close to the market here. There's lots of restaurants. So the restaurants are all competing one with another. But once you enter the restaurant, you make your choice, you are actually in a very non-rivalrous, in fact, cooperative environment. As the clientele is not competing with the servers. The servers are not competing with the chef. The manager is not competing with the workers. It's very cooperative. And in fact, the language is cooperative. Can I assist you? Have you been served? Is there anything else I can do for you? Is there anything else that you need? Right? Maybe the waiter goes back in and the chef says, was everything all right? Were they pleased with the food? Or could you please go and tell them to be patient? Something has gone wrong here. Maybe offer them a free appetizer, so whatever. So that environment, everybody in that environment is cooperating. You go to a supermarket, you're not a rival of the, you think of this, you go up to a supermarket to a total stranger and say, where do they sell the, organic almonds, blanched, not roasted? And that person is expected to say, well, sir, they're on aisle 5, under the organic almonds, roasted, not blanched, right? And we expect that's normal, that a total stranger would help you out because you're in a cooperative environment. In fact, it's the case that we learn how to be kind to others and to assist others usually in the family circle amongst our friends. But vis-a-vis strangers, the only place we really do it often is in economic life, right? Where someone offers you help and we are accustomed to expecting it and offering it to others. So if you think of economic life as collaborative or cooperative, all of a sudden you see, okay, this is an environment akin to being with friends and family, or colleagues, or friends. I've said friends already, colleagues, collaborators, I meant to say. And therefore, we know how to treat each other well. Right? And I think most people think of the free market economy as the virtues of competition in terms of efficiency and allocation and so forth, and therefore they make a mistake. It's not a mistake in theory, it's a mistake in fact that most of economic life is competitive. And if most of economic life is competitive, it means we're rivals with other people, our interests are conflict with other people, and therefore we actually do or are tempted to do things that undermine their interests. But that's not actually what economic life is. Economic life is by a huge percentage, I would say, in favor of cooperation. Most of our economic activity, we're cooperating with everybody in the firm we work with and our customers. We're only competing as a whole against another business, right? And then there's businesses that actually have what we'd call in the animal world a symbiotic relationship. So, having, there's a shopping mall across the way. So the stores there compete with each other. Yeah, they do. But also they're cooperating because, if you come in for one store, you might stop at another store. You don't want to be the only store in the whole mall that has something of interest to people because no one's going to come to the mall, right? So even in the competitive environment, there's a collaborative dimension. Okay. So I'm going to, I've gone way too long here. That's all right. Sorry about that. I lost track of time. That's why we keep Renzo off where I can't see him. So he's been, for all I know, he's been waving frantically for 20 minutes. Anyway, so I'll stop there, and then Renzo's going to have question and answer. So God bless you. Thanks.
All right. So we have a bit of time for questions. I'm going to get just a bit, but I'm gonna start off with a couple, but I'm gonna quickly move to the room. So while you're thinking about them, I'm just gonna get started with one. It sounds to me like a lot of what your lecture is about is about trying to turn the head on how people see the market in terms of virtue and vice, and say that it actually can be a school of virtue. I think I heard you use that term. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about how virtues come about, and ask a question: is the market the best teacher of virtue? Are there other teachers of virtue that are really important as well for economic life, and can even the government be a teacher of virtue?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because if you said, just as an opening statement, what is a better school of virtue, the family or a fast food restaurant? Right? Where do you learn virtue? More in your family or working at McDonald's? What's that? Yeah, but then why do parents want their kids to go and work at McDonald's? Right? So obviously one answer is clearly the family is more important than a fast food restaurant. But it's a very common experience. People say, well, there are certain virtues that don't seem to be taking here, or at least in this moment, in this circumstance, so we want you to work. Now, fast food restaurant maybe is makes it too dramatic. Maybe you could work on a farm, right? You could deliver newspapers, which used to be a thing that when the newspaper industry had newspapers that we printed that were delivered and people wanted them, but so there are certain things that even in just common experience we know are that there are virtues that the economic world can teach that don't seem to be taught well elsewhere. But the key thing is that there's a sort of paradox, is that virtue is the capacity to use your freedom well, right? So habitually to order your freedom to some good end. That's what a virtue is. So I'm free to tell the truth, I'm free to tell lies. I have the virtue of honesty if I habitually use my freedom to tell the truth, right? That's what a virtue is. So how do we teach people how to use their freedom well in a virtuous way? Well, we usually do it by removing or constraining or eliminating their freedom, right? So people learn virtue in unfree environments. The primary one is, of course, in the family, where the parents constrict in many ways or abolish the freedom of their children. Right? So, especially even with little children, they physically, right, they do things that children, as they pick them up, shouldn't be over here. They pick them up and move them elsewhere, which would be considered an assault if it was adults and strangers, right? But it's normal behavior, right? Grab the child, drag him from one place to the other. I'm teaching him not to go near the fire. It's dangerous, right? But you're using coercion, and we wouldn't say violence, but physical coercion is another definition of violence. But anyway, um, but that's how we raise children, and then you teach virtue on a football team, in a school play, in a symphony, in the military. We teach virtue by creating environments in which freedom is not permitted. All right. So there's no freedom on a football team at practice. The coach says one thing, everybody does it. There's no freedom in a symphony when the conductor decides. There's no freedom in a platoon. We have an MP here. There's no freedom in a government caucus or an opposition caucus or in the cabinet or God knows where. There's not any freedom. So that's how we teach virtue. We don't allow freedom in order to teach virtue so we can use freedom well. It's a bit of a paradox. What's interesting about the market is that the market, there's not coercive power, right? So your teenage child comes in and is rude to you, and in order to teach him that he should be not rude, you coerce him, you eliminate his freedom, you take away something from him, you make his life somehow lesser. And that's how you try to teach him that he should not be rude. You go into a store and you don't have any coercive power over the people in the store, but yet they're not rude to you. If they were rude to you, you wouldn't have the capacity to coerce them. So your freedom is meeting their freedom, and you have no coercion. You don't have the authority of a conductor or a coach or a parent to eliminate, constrain, remove the freedom of the other, to have good behavior. The only power you have over the clerk in the store not to be rude to you is if you're rude, I don't come back here. You could, but what if the manager's the one who's rude? Right? So it's really a remarkable phenomenon because, generally speaking, with very few exceptions, we teach virtue, which is the good exercise of freedom, in environments of unfreedom. I gave you 5 or 6 examples. That's generally how we do it. The market tries to get people, rather, in the market, there are people who don't have coercive power over the other, who in their freedom are seeing if they can live virtuously. And those free interactions actually they're a pretty effective school of virtue, right? It's very interesting. You can be outside. You can walk past you can watch, say a work site, construction site, and the men are walking down the street towards the site from wherever they park their vehicles, and their language is very rough, right? And the topics they're discussing are maybe very unvirtuous. And as soon as they cross over the boundary, they may change. They may not. Depends on the site, but there's a different environment, right? The client is there, right? We're working on, we're doing a renovation on this house, and the people who own the house are there, so we don't swear in their presence, right? That's it. That's it. So it shows, because it's strange among strangers. There's more. So that's it. In terms of where we learn virtue largely and properly in environments where there's control over us, so that we can be free. The market is attractive from the virtue teaching point of view because it provides a way for strangers who don't have coercive power over each other to encourage virtue. So I don't think most people think that, but I think that's actually a good description of what happens.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to shift to something else you talked about, and that is around the relationship to riches. So you talked about, I think it was in the second part of your lecture, that Christian teaching, the Bible, they don't condemn riches per se. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And yet, as you pointed out, you can't read the Gospels without, as you said, being very nervous about it. So Now, let's put that in the context of a 21st century North American culture, like we're in right now, where pretty much everybody is rich by historical standards. Uh, so that calls us to, I think, be a little nervous with our relative prosperity as well. What is the proper virtuous attitude toward the riches that, let's be honest, a middle income type person in North America should be adopting?
Yeah, I think that probably we need to. I think from a spiritual point of view, I'm not talking about a sort of doctrinal point of view of specifying what exactly the scriptures teach about are riches immoral, is wealth immoral. I think that's a good task, but I think from a spiritual point of view, it'd be better if we read the Gospels and didn't try to justify what it apparently condemns, right? So when we read the Gospels, we say, well, yes, it's saying that riches are very dangerous, but it doesn't condemn them outright, so it's okay. That's how we tend to think of it. It'd be better spiritually for us if we just said, man, I'm a rich person, and that is not a good place to be, which we're not inclined to say that. But it would probably lead us, that kind of conviction would lead us to be a lot more severe with our relationship with goods. I mean, you can imagine, as Canadians, we're going to go to our judgment day and maybe get asked a question. You had so many goods that you couldn't store them all. Did you never read? Like, you had 3 storage lockers. So did you never read about the parable? Did you miss that? Right? I mean, there's nothing in the Gospels about streaming services, but you might be asked, you have 6 of them, right? You have access to 7,000 hours of archival sports programming, which is longer than your lifespan. So why did you buy that? So it's hard to answer those questions. And, I think that for example, when I worked on campus for a long time, and when I asked students, what is the great cultural challenge to Christian living, discipleship, they always answer something to do with sexuality, right? So something like that, pornography or whatever. And I mean, they're not wrong about that in one way, but I said, I think actually probably a greater threat in our culture to Christian living is that our culture is driven, overwhelmingly by recreation. That everything that's presented to us is, the streaming services, on demand. You can, even when you're walking between one place to the other, can watch a movie. That you're never apart from being amused. And I said, I think, and that's a fact. That's a kind of a product of our technological economic culture. So I think we need to have, contemplate, to be a Christian involves some radical decisions, and we're good in certain spheres of life. Sexuality is one of them, to say, okay, there's the dominant way of thinking. We don't live that way. So we have to oppose that, right? Or another, we might say that industry is immoral. We don't participate in that. But some of the other aspects of the culture in economics, boy, we're not so good at that. Is to say, well, Christians don't do that, right? If you were to say, as a preacher were to say, Christians don't live in 8,000 square foot houses, period, full stop. That would be, yeah. Now someone said, well, actually, you can be very, there was King, Louis, he was a saint. But, we don't say those kinds of things. And we have a lot of conspicuous consumption. And I'm not saying, see, now I'm very careful because they're recording this. I didn't say you can't live in an 8,000 square foot house, because maybe I'd like to visit you there one day, I don't know. But, we're not, there's certain things where we see excesses and we say, okay, we don't do that as Christians. And it's not controversial. But when it comes to what the Gospels talk about a lot in a very affluent society, that's a weakness of ours.
Okay. I'm going to open up to questions from the floor. So I see a lot of hands. So the first one I saw was Molly.
Here come the 8,000 square foot homeowners. How big is your apartment? 8,000 square feet.
Not quite. Thank you for the lecture, Father Raymond. I really appreciated what you were saying about Adam Smith's, like your summary of Adam Smith's, like recognize, imagine, and then either benevolence or self-interest. With that, something that I thought of is it's like a lot of that is just like that economic activity is it's like you have to help people in order to actually like receive compensation or whatever from them. And one thing that I've heard people talk about a lot is like when they're talking about like what they want to do like in their career and that sort of thing is they say something like, I really want a career where I can help people. And sort of the point that I understood that you were making is kind of like you have to help people or they're not going to compensate you,
Okay.
right? And so I'm curious what you think people are getting at when they say that. Like, is it like they feel like the economic activity is stealing their thunder because they want to help people, but they want to be able to do it just from
No.
benevolence, or is it something else?
Well, that's a good question. And I would say, in general, young people who are tend to be more idealistic, which is a good thing. They should be. Underestimate the service to the common good that can be achieved through entrepreneurial activity. That's probably so. They think of, if I want to help people, I should do something that's very evidently like teaching, nursing, medicine. But they don't think, well, if I started a business that employed a lot of people, they don't think that that's serving people, right? So occasionally you'll get sort of criticisms about, say, because the economy we have today, the last 20 years, generates an astonishing returns to few people. So you could say, well, should that tech billionaire have $1 billion? That doesn't seem right. And in many ways, it's hard to justify it. But if you wanted to justify it, you could say, well, he actually has made life much easier for an entire for millions of people, right, in a way that no one else could do by inventing some sort of thing, right? So inventiveness, both in the technological sense, like inventing, I know, electricity, or not, I guess you discover electricity, but you invent something, but also inventiveness in entrepreneurship. If you're, if you're, let me put it this way: if you were directly giving food to the poor, people say that's the service you're doing, right? If you are a cattle rancher who provides nutritious and cheap food through a market mechanism, which is how most people get their food, that's also a kind of a service to the poor. So we have to be, I think we do underestimate the value of entrepreneurship and markets and serving. Like, for example, in Canada, we have the consensus view is that healthcare is too important a thing that it should be left to the market entirely. So we have our system, and actually every country in the world has that view. No country leaves healthcare entirely to the market. However, food is also important. You might even say food is more important than healthcare. But for the most part, food in every country in the world is left to the market, right? So it shows our ways of thinking are not entirely consistent, right? We say this is so important, we can't leave it to the market, healthcare, but no country does, right? But food is even more important than healthcare, and every country leaves it to the market to provide food, right? So, but people don't think of that. So I think that you're onto something there. We underestimate the value of service to the common good that comes through entrepreneurship or business.
Okay, Patrick, yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Father Raymond. Just one thread or one gap I'm hoping you can close. I mean, you spent a lot of time quoting from scripture on the dangers of wealth or love of wealth. But when we look at things like Catholic social teaching from Leo XIII to John Paul II and their generally favorable take on market structures, I mean, surely that tradition is anchored in scripture. And I think of some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, the prosperity gospel, presumably that has roots or origins in verses of scripture. So can you kind of complete the line of thought? Yes, there is a lot in scripture talking to the dangers of wealth, but surely is there not a counterbalance that we can take a little bit of solace or direction from in terms of the benefits of wealth, or is it really just that kind of stark proposition that you've laid out?
Well, I think that What I would say is that the modern tradition of, say, Catholic social teaching, or even in the Protestant Orthodox churches, emerges in this world of material abundance, which is something new, right? So one of the cautions when you read the scriptures is that their economic environment of the scriptures is not the same as it is for us today. To give an analogy, uh, fundamental to the gospel imagery is water. They're on the sea and so forth. The sea is understood for them as a primary place of danger and death, right? Which is why the storms are so threatening. There was no recreational water sports or craft in the biblical time, right? So we think of the waters, people spend a lot of money to build houses by the water or cottages, and we think of the waters as a place of recreation. So we have a total incapacity to understand the symbolism of water in the Bible in Canada today, because we don't think of waters as dangerous. So we don't understand it. It's just we cannot understand the role of water in the Bible because it's a plane of death. That's why immersion baptisms are immersed into the death of Christ, because that's what happened when you go into the waters, a place of death. We can't understand that. On the flip side, the economic environment of the Bible, like most of human history, did not have economic growth. There was reallocation and there was taking. So how do you serve the poor? You serve the poor by not going through the field a second time to collect the remnants of the harvest, but to leave that for someone else. Because the Bible is entirely constructed in a world of distribution, not in terms of growth. So the kinds of teachings you're referencing are taking into account that you could have economic growth. And if you don't have economic growth, maybe something's wrong with how you've organized your economy. So in that sense, that would maybe help. There's a gap there, which I didn't address, is that the economic view of the Bible is largely about distribution because economic growth was not a reality at that time. That's why certain things that were treated differently in the biblical time, like collateral, like interest and so forth, right? Like Jesus says, if you take a man's cloak as collateral, you have to give it back to him because he has to have something to sleep in that night, right? You can't just let him freeze. Well, we don't offer cloaks as collateral anymore, right? There's a document, there's a deed. So that part has changed. And so modern social teaching, whether Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox or Jewish or whatever for that matter, is in a different world. And so the freedom to create wealth is, we think of it now as, okay, we have this freedom, it's given to us by God, we have creativity, it's part of being in the image of God, and therefore that should have an outlet in our economic life. But that position, the premise of that is that you can actually have creation of wealth. And that really is not part of the way people thought until maybe 500 years ago. So I think that would be what's added by the modern economic experience. But that all being said, all of the stuff that I quoted is mostly about the spiritual dangers of riches, and that is just as applicable today. I mean, I'm not going to get into this question, but there are people who think that the reason that the contemporary world is less religiously animated is because of this astonishing, not just growth of prosperity from, say, 1600 onwards, but say from 1950 onwards. I mean, it's just totally amazing that, you have economies that are 5, 10, 25 times the size they were 50 years ago. And maybe that's a factor, but that's that.
The wealthier you are, the wealthier, the less they are in society.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Go ahead.
Here.
Thank you for the for the talk. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit more on the correlation between reward and learning of virtue. Like you talked
Reward
about
and learning.
reward.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
So we talked
sure.
about learning virtue in the marketplace. I'm a parent of teenage kids too, and it's kind of nice to encourage them to go and get a job. But I'm thinking of it more not
Right.
they're going to learn virtue in an environment where freedom can be taken
Correct.
away, but because they get rewarded. Similarly, for someone in grade 12
Right,
who
yeah.
wants to get a scholarship, like you talked about, some of the virtue of discipline, doing the work properly, pursuing excellence is because there's a reward at the end.
Right.
So I'm
Okay.
wondering if you can just touch
Sure.
on that.
Okay. Thank you. That's good. I left that out. So Thank you. I love the fact you can give a talk and you go 20 minutes overtime, and then someone says, "Could you please expand on the following issues?" uh, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because kind of the little jokes I made. I was illustrating a environment of unfreedom with the disciplinary or coercive element of it. But an environment of unfreedom can also include rewards, right? I've emphasized, like with the child, you sort of constrain the child. But a symphony conductor, I mean, you can't decide in the symphony when you're going to play. The conductor decides when things are going to be played. But in how he manages the symphony, he could use disciplinary things and coercive things and punishments, but he could also use rewards, right? So that's good to clarify. That is that even in an environment of unfreedom, it's not just coercion; it can be rewards. As a coach or a teacher, any number of people, employer would use both. And then the same thing applies in what I was trying to compare it to in the market world, where you don't have authority over other people, then both punishments and rewards. So, for example, I use the negative example of going into store, someone's rude, and then you punish them by leaving the store. You don't give them your custom, you leave. But it could be on the flip side, right? Is that someone comes in and is polite, and then you say, "Oh, I'll give you my business." So there's a reward there. So both things operate there. From the spiritual ideal, there's that saying, virtue is its own reward, right? So that I do the virtuous act because it's a good act and not because of a good outcome, right? So that's the ideal, is that we do a good act because it's a good act, not because, right? Like sometimes summarized by doing something good when no one else is watching, right? So there's no reward for it. No one else knows about it. So that, I think I would say is a little bit more, that's a spiritual goal that would come from, I think, a formation. Well, let me put it this way. At a certain point, if formation is good, it increases the amount of freedom that is involved in it. So, for example, if parents were raising a teenager like they raised a 5-year-old, there's some kind of failure there has to be more freedom there. And ideally, the child or whoever would see the virtue as its own reward and not just the punishment or the benefit. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just trying to get clarification if that's okay or not.
The reward, yeah. Right. I see. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a good question, because you could say if virtue is its own reward, there's no other reward. And then somebody says, "Well, hey, I'm not that interested in it. I'd like, I'd like the other reward." A lot of, if I don't know if you like Star Wars or not, right? But that's in the first one. That's there's this good cause, right? The rebel cause, and Luke Skywalker embracing it's a good cause, and Han Solo embracing because he's going to get a reward from it. And they try and compare who's those are the two, and that's one. It's a very ancient story. Do you do it for the glory, right? You do it for the goodness of it. Famous speech at Henry V, right? Henry V says, doesn't try to encourage them before the Battle of Agincourt on, we've got a great cause. He says, "Hey, there's only a few of us. We're going to have more glory than anybody else has ever had," right? So he's appealing to both, right? There's different kinds of appeals. What you eventually want is someone to do the right thing for its own reason, right? And you can see that in business. You can see that in the economic spheres, that people can run a business, and a good business, and then they may do things that in this specific instance are not in their self-interest. They think it's a good thing to do, right? So they give someone a second chance, or they forgive someone's debt, and so they've come to see that the end, that's, and I think, and that is okay. That is okay.
Other questions?
Just on that note, is reward a better teacher than constraints or punishment? And is that
No.
why
No.
no?
Well, sure. It depends on the maturity of the person, you know. But yeah, yeah, yeah. So well, you know, it says in the that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's not the end of wisdom, but you know, the fear of the Lord that's the beginning, right? You know, a man I'm close to, you know, once said about raising his children, said, "I don't want my children to be afraid of me." And how could you argue with that, right? Why would you want children to be afraid of their parents? But you want in order for the good formation of the children, they have to be afraid of displeasing their parents. And that's a hard line because can you be afraid of displeasing your parents without being afraid of your parents, right? That's not easy to figure out. But if you're not afraid of either, you know, at an early level, the beginning, you know, that with a good scriptural warrant for that. The beginning, fear. Later, reward, right? That's a question of maturity. But I think it's very difficult. I mean, you might have a new relationship with with a new person, and he might already be a very mature person, so he's already had his formation. But I think at the beginning, I think fear is at the fear of a bad outcome.
That's where virtue is taught in a sense, like where a parent wants their kid to get a summer job to learn.
Yeah, it's a good question because there's not a lot of fear in the marketplace in one sense. But you know, one of the things which was not what I got into today, but in order to even have a market, there has to be a basic level of virtue. People have to agree to honor their agreements and so forth. So you're presuming the market to exist already presumes that in other environments, people have learned these virtues, namely in families, first of all. They've learned those virtues in order to have it. So, like when I said, what's better to learn virtue, a family or a fast food restaurant? Obviously, the answer is the family. But there are certain things that don't seem to get taught there, so the market can help with that. Yeah, can help with that. But yeah, I think that's the goal. Certainly, is you know at the end of the day, right? In face of our judgment, we want to be motivated by love, not by fear. But the beginning, you know, is fear. You know, in the Catholic tradition, if you're sorry for your sins because you are afraid of the consequences of it, we call that imperfect contrition, which is not a bad thing. And if you're sorry for your sins because you grieve the offense you've given to someone you love, that's called perfect contrition, which is a better thing. But it's very hard to start with perfect contrition. That's why it's called perfect, because you get there, usually start with imperfect, I think.
And just as a plug for next lecture, which is about charity, which I think is probably where this is all going, I suspect. But I do see a question with Brendan here.
Oh, very good.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'll try to keep my question short.
He's one of the candidates for the $1,000, by the way, Monica. He's been here all 3 times.
My question is, can you actually teach virtue an hour? And I looked to Aristotle, where he talks about a state of character, and it built on training and educating and reinforcing good habits, and that carried on in medieval time. There's a great worry, I would say, in the last 20 years, that our culture is lost and our youth are lost, and lots of people don't know how to fix it. Do you ever, what's your feeling about the present day about our youth, and is it possible to teach them virtue, and how would you accomplish that?
It's always good to have a little bite-sized question to end the evening. Well, first of all, I would just say that you look at history, there are periods of disillusion and chaos and decadence, and then they don't last forever. So we just know that in sometimes ways that we might find hard to see, that good things emerge when good things are decaying and good things are emerging. And if you're in a period of decay, as your question suggests, it might be hard to see where the good things are emerging. So yeah, but I mean, history is not, unidirectional. Things change. You know, you see all of a sudden, well, things are better in this place where they used to be worse before. You know, I'm struck. You know, we're thinking a lot about war these last year, and you know, you see. I mean, it's quite discouraging, obviously. But then you see the figures. You know, 25,000 people killed in Gaza, or 1,000 people killed in the original attacks, and then you go back and you say, you know, there were battles in the First World War where 10,000 people died in one morning. We can't even imagine. Even though our technology is much greater, we would actually find it hard to kill 10,000 people in one morning. How they actually did it is a bit, it's actually. I mean, logistics are not the most important thing, but you kind of work. Like, how did they do that, right? So, in that sense, I'm saying that even when we see things that are concerning to us, we can see other examples where maybe there's been an improvement. Young people, I mean, I spent most of my priesthood on campus, so I think about this a lot. There are challenges that they face that even I, who I'm older than them, but not that much older than them, did not face. That are largely driven by the technological, digital information culture, and that it's something that's so new, we're still learning about it. And so, although it's very discouraging in many ways, especially if you're in the newspaper business, but there might be a solution. Like, for example, social media, it's 15 years old, 20, I don't know, whatever, it's old. And the mayor of New York City, who's by no means kind of, a sort of, ultra, conservative technophobe or something, just declared a public health emergency in New York City for social media for minors, I guess. So not that he has a particular, there's not a particular policy thing, but it starts with saying, okay, that this is dangerous enough to our. So that's the beginning. Now, what things will look like 10 years from now, I don't know, but there's certainly an awareness today of you said the word lost youth, that there's a lot of attention being paid to that. I had the honor, for me anyway, there's an economist at Princeton named Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015. And he wrote a book around 2013 or around that time. And the theme of the book was that people are anxious, but things have never been better economically. And he gives all the statistics. And the opening line of that book is, things have never been better, basically. And so that was 13, 14. I met him recently, and he said, I couldn't write that line today because in this last 10 years, things are worse than they were 10 years ago. So I do worry about that, and there's a kind of a sense of things being lost, but there's an awareness that there's a problem, a serious problem that wasn't even there 3 or 4 years ago. Now, it doesn't mean there's a readily apparent solution, but something that would have been thought impossible in, say, 2015 or 2016, that the state or a school or a family might intervene in a radical way, to eliminate social media access or pornography access or anything, now are not so unusual. There are schools now that are trying to get away from. I mean, and the thing in New York City really struck me. It's a very liberal city. The mayor is from that culture, and they decided that. So there's a lot to worry about, about a lost generation. And there's a lot of unhappiness, a lot of anxiety, a lot of despair and sadness amongst young people, which is very sad because it should be a very happy, phase of life. But because there's so much attention to it, I have to think that with so many people seized with this idea, we're going to see a lot of potential responses, and some of those will be good responses, and some of them will catch on. Because the thing that you said, if you'd asked that question 5 or 10 years ago, people said you're a bit of a crank for worrying about this. Well, yes. No, that you are a crank is not in doubt. That's well known. That's what he's been. But they would have said you're a bit of a crank. But today, what you just said, people wouldn't give you that response, which is different than even recently.
All right, well, on that bite-sized and hopeful note, I
Right.
guess, I don't know how hopeful, but we're probably going to have to end it
Okay.
there, but we can take the conversation
Right on time,
to,
8 o'clock.
there you go. Couldn't have done better. We can take the conversation around the food and drinks, so please do stick around for a little bit and talk to Father Raymond and each other. Let's thank Father Raymond as well for an excellent presentation.